If today you can take a thing like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in the public school, tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in the private schools, and the next year you can make it a crime to teach it in the hustings or in the church. At the next session you may ban books and the newspapers, and soon you may set Catholic against Protestant and Protestant against Protestant and try to foist your own religion upon the minds of men. If you can do one, you can do the others. Ignorance and fanaticism is ever feeding, ever busy and ever feeding. After a while, Your Honor, it is the setting of man against man and creed against creed, until with flying banners and beating drums, we are marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots burned the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind. Pretty good, huh? If that speech sounds familiar to some of you, you're probably thinking you heard it when you saw the movie Inherit the Wind. And yes, words very similar to those appear in the movie. Except what I just read to you are not the words of playwrights or screenwriters spoken by an actor. Those were the real words of a real lawyer in a real trial that occurred in July 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee. Good morning, I'm Doug Mishkin. When I was about 11 years old, I recall, I was home from school for a week, sick. Each day I watched the 1 o'clock movie. Each day the same movie, Inherit the Wind. Spencer Tracy, Frederick March, Gene Kelly. I was hooked. Now, sadly, I already had the idea that I was heading to law school, but I distinctly remember thinking, this is terrible. I'm going to law school, and they've already tried the most fascinating trial imaginable. What I didn't imagine was that 100 years later, we'd still be trying that case. I taught this course in 2019. I wasn't going to teach it again, but this July marks the 100th anniversary of what came to be known as the Scopes monkey trial, and I couldn't let that go. Now, if there are some of you who took the course in 2019, welcome back, and you have my word, read my lips, no new jokes. Why should anyone care about the Scopes trial? Because it was interesting and important now more than ever. Interesting, it was fascinating. It was dramatic. It was entertaining. It was an extraordinary confluence of time and place, and what a cast of characters. The popular impression of the trial has been shaped largely by the play and then the movie Inherit the Wind. In Lecture 5, we will take an in-depth look at Inherit, as it's called in the business. We'll try to do that to grasp its role in the American understanding of the Scopes trial. But the actual trial was so much more interesting. The real trial is a great story. It's a series of great stories. So my thesis is, if you're going to hear the phrase Scopes monkey trial, you should know what actually happened. But the trial was more than interesting, it was important. The litigants fought about religion and education, free speech, science, school curricula, textbooks. It's what we're fighting about today. In the final lecture, I'm going to try to pull all of this together to capture the many dimensions of the legacy of the trial, the law, the politics, the big picture. In lectures 2, 3, and 4, I'll take us into the courtroom. We'll go through the 8 days of the trial in some detail. We'll explore some well-known excerpts and some trial moments that you would have no way of knowing about. You need to know this stuff to make sense of Inherit the Wind and the legacy of the trial. But I'm going to do it for another reason, so I'm just going to confess to you now. I'm going to do a deep dive into the trial because it's fun, at least my idea of fun. Some trials feature a smoking gun or DNA evidence or photographs of a crime scene or an interesting document. The currency of the Scopes trial was language, and some of it was soaring oratory. I want to share large portions of it with you, even when it means a fair amount of reading he said, then he said, then he said, because I want you to hear what these extraordinary characters said in their own words, not my or somebody else's characterization of it. It grieves me that there is no audio recording of the trial, but there is a transcript, and I rely on the transcript as well as memoirs of Darrow and Bryan and some of the other lawyers, and especially John T. Scopes. There's also a recent biography of Scopes by Professor Randy Moore. Let me give you a brief word about me. I'm a lawyer. No, really, hold your applause, hold your applause. I practiced law in Washington, D.C. for 37 years before moving to Egremont in the fall of 2018. I'm of counsel to a small firm that represents low-income tenants in housing court. I'm on the Egremont Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, and I'm a singer-songwriter who's about to release his third album. But I think we can all agree it would be highly inappropriate of me to use this course to promote my music. All of which can be found on my website, dougmishkin.com. That's dougmishkin.com. All right, but more to the point for this course. I am fascinated by and passionate about the relationship between religion and science, between religion and government, what in the old days we would have called the separation of church and state. I have done pro bono legal work for Americans United for separation of church and state. I mention this in the spirit of full disclosure. I have deep conviction about these issues. And while I'm here principally to inform and hopefully stimulate you, I have a high degree of confidence that my convictions will ring loud and clear, particularly in our final class. Agree with me, disagree with me, it's all good. I have compiled and am posting online a list of books, articles, and some cases. Please, there's no homework, there's no required reading. These lectures will stand or fall on their own. But I just want you to have these resources in case you're interested. However, I do strongly encourage that you go back and watch or rewatch the movie Inherit the Wind sometime before our fifth class on April 29th. Google it, you'll find it's available for rental, various options on streaming. The list of resources includes a book entitled Summer for the Gods, The Scopes Trial and America's Continuing Debate Over Science and Religion. The book deservedly won the Pulitzer Prize in History in 1997. The author is historian Edward J. Larson. Mark your calendars. I will be interviewing Professor Larson, as Judith said. I'll be interviewing him for OLLI on Monday night, May 12th, the week after this course ends. I have already told Professor Larson to expect the best prepared audience ever for one of his public presentations. One more housekeeping matter, Q&A. We may amend this policy going forward, but for now, if you'd like to submit a question, please email me at dmishkin@outlook.com. It's dmishkin@outlook.com. I will try and take up the email in the next session. In this hybrid format, it could get a little clunky to try to do it otherwise. Right, let me be clear about what this course is not. It's not an intellectual or social history of religious fundamentalism in late 19th and early 20th century America, or a history of education during that period. As I always say in my OLLI presentations, if you want an intellectual, sign up for my friend Kate Kidd. This is also not a course on evolution or Darwin or how natural selection works. My objectives for this course, like my capabilities, are more limited. I propose to tell you the story of the trial in more detail than you've heard it before, and to help you better appreciate its significance then and now. All right, let's get down to cases. I want to begin by observing the Scopes monkey trial is a triple misnomer. It was not about Scopes, it was not about monkeys, and it wasn't really a trial. What do I mean? First, it wasn't really about Scopes. We'll talk about him, but as you'll hear, if it hadn't been Scopes, it surely would have been someone else. Scopes probably did not actually teach evolution, and he said nothing during the trial until after the jury returned its verdict. Point number two, it certainly was not about monkeys. Darwinian theory does not have human beings descending from monkeys or apes. It's not even accurate to say that the trial was about evolution. Evolutionary theory concerns all species. The fundamentalists, represented by the state of Tennessee, were concerned only with one aspect of Darwin, his approach to human evolution. Lastly, it wasn't really a trial. Yes, it was in a courthouse, there was a judge, there was a jury, there were lawyers arguing on each side, but trials are about factual disputes. Legal issues get resolved by judges. Did Scopes dispute what he allegedly taught? No, although as you'll see, that almost surely wasn't true. He did not actually teach what he was accused of teaching, but the defense didn't want that to be the issue. It didn't want to win that way. It wanted to test the law. And the prosecution needed Scopes to have taught as alleged because it needed a defendant for reasons that will become clearer in a few minutes. Most of the courtroom time was spent with lawyers arguing legal points or making ad hominem attacks. The jury was rarely in the courtroom. It was 1925. World War I had ended 7 years earlier. In his book, Professor Larson discusses how in this country the First World War had led to a systematic assault on personal liberty from what had previously been isolated incidents. He says the war changed everything. And out of this grew the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, the Reader's Digest version is that the ACLU was born in opposition to what we would call majoritarian impulses of the time, namely the idea shared by President Woodrow Wilson and others that the majority could restrict free speech and other individual rights in a time of war. Larson writes that this anti-majoritarian impulse profoundly influenced the ACLU's response to the anti-evolution crusade, because after the war, the ACLU shifted its focus from advocating for pacifists to serving the cause of labor. So said its founder, Roger Baldwin, and labor included public school teachers. So Larson describes how the ACLU had, to this time, had not had success in court advocating for labor unions. They were increasingly resorting to direct action, protests, and the like. At the time of the Scopes trial in 1925, Larson says the ACLU was still looking for its first court victory. 1925, Calvin Coolidge had been elected president the year before. Those born that year included Robert F. Kennedy Sr., Malcolm X, Margaret Thatcher, Johnny Carson, Barbara Bush, Medgar Evers, Yogi Berra, and a personal favorite, and he's still with us, Dick Van Dyke. Christian fundamentalism was on the rise. For a detailed social and intellectual history of what set the stage for the 1925 trial in Dayton, I commend to you another book by Larson, his 1985 book entitled Trial and Error, The American Controversy Over Creation and Evolution. In a few brief sentences, Larson tells us that before Darwin, American scientists typically accepted the biblically orthodox view that God directly created every type of species. Leading scientists like Harvard zoologist Louis Agassiz wrote that the truth of the biblical story of creation was confirmed the revelations of science, which unequivocally indicate the direct interventions of creative power, end quote. Origin of Species was published in 1859. Larson says, the first generation of American scientists trained after the publication of Origin of Species began writing high school textbooks in the 1880s, and they were evolutionary. Hunter's A Civic Biology was the most widely used high school biology textbook at the beginning of the anti-evolution movement. We're going to hear more about Hunter's Civic Biology later. But high schools were teaching this stuff before the anti-evolution movement. So what kept the anti-evolutionists? Larson notes a couple of possibilities. One is that the general expansion of public education provoked the anti-evolution crowd. Another factor may have been what Larson calls the passing of the evangelical evolutionists, those who reconciled religious orthodoxy with evolution. Let's share the screen. And before we go any further, I want to thank publicly my new best friend, Judith Weiner, who agreed to handle the PowerPoint for today and other lectures, and to OLLI volunteer Daryl Brook, who took a set of pretty weak-looking PowerPoints from a few years ago and spiffed them up. On January 21st, 1925, John Washington Butler introduced House Bill number 185, Chapter 27 in the General Assembly of Tennessee. Who was this Butler? Author Ray Ginger, the author of a good book about the trial, 6 Days or Forever. Ginger tells us that Butler was from a long-time corn and tobacco farming family in Macon County in north central Tennessee. County didn't have a single mile of railroad track. He taught school for 5 years. He taught in the fall, and he raised his crops on the family farm in the spring. And the story is that Butler heard a visiting preacher describe a young woman in his Tennessee community who enrolled in a biology course at a nearby university. The preacher said afterwards she was no longer a Christian because evolution destroyed her faith in God. And Butler asked himself whether evolution could turn one of his own 3 boys into an atheist. In 1922, Butler, a Democrat, was elected state representative by promising to protect school children from the effects of the godless doctrine of evolution. We can stop. Butler's bill passed the House 7 days after he introduced it by a vote of 71 to 5. No public hearings. When one legislator asked for debate, Butler replied, I don't see the need for any further talk, as everyone knows what evolution means. But the press got on the case. A Tennessee Senate committee voted down the bill, and the anti-evolutionists were in an uproar. Fundamentalist evangelist Billy Sunday preached, education today is chained to the devil's throne, and he congratulated the Tennessee House for having the courage to take action against the God-forsaken gang of evolutionary cutthroats. The tide turned in favor of Butler's bill. On March 13th, the Senate approved it overwhelmingly. It rejected the arguments of one Republican legislature who blamed the whole controversy on, quote, that greatest of all disturbers of the public and political life from the last 28 or 30 years, I mean William Jennings Bryan. Brenda Wineapple, author of Keeping the Faith, a 2024 book about the trial, reports that one of the no votes from Senator Giles Evans said the Butler bill was unconstitutional. And he said he suspected that defenders of the bill had no problem with evolution itself. It was the idea that people originated from monkeys. Let's share. The governor of Tennessee was Governor Austin Peay, a progressive. The year before, he had defeated a lawyer named John Neal for the governorship. Hold that thought. Some had hoped that Governor Peay would veto the bill. No such luck. When he signed the Butler Act into law on March 21st, he assured the world, probably the law will never be applied. It may not be sufficiently definite to permit of any specific application or endorsement. Nobody believes that it is going to be an active statute. Real pundit, that Governor Peay. Let's stop the share. The law contained the penalty of a monetary fine, not a jail sentence. William Jennings Bryan himself wrote to a Tennessee state senator urging that there be no penalty. He said that would be a distraction, that the law should just be a resolution. The fine stayed. Hold that thought. Share the screen, please. Here's the text of the Butler Act that was enacted into law. Right? It shall be unfaithful. I'm sorry. That's a Freudian slip. It shall be unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities or normals, the schools of education, and all other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the public school funds of the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Again, it's against the law to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Signed into law March 21st. The ACLU had been monitoring legislation across the country for this kind of thing. On Monday, May 4th, 1925, the ACLU ran an ad in the Chattanooga Daily Times offering to finance a case to challenge the Butler Act. We can stop. On the same day, that newspaper ran a story about the ACLU planning this test case. The article said there's little likelihood that the test case proposed by a northern organization will be staged here. Oh, you can hold that thought as well. The story then quoted from an ACLU press release. We are looking for a Tennessee teacher who's willing to accept our services in teaching and testing the law in the courts. Our lawyers think a friendly test case can be arranged without costing a teacher his or her job. By this test, we hope to render a real service to freedom of teaching throughout the country. Now listen to how the ACLU framed the issue. It was about freedom of speech and of teaching. The ACLU's perspective was not shared by all. Others, principally Clarence Darrow, saw the issue differently. And that difference mattered when decisions were made about who was going to try the case and how. In Dayton, Tennessee, a man named George Rapelier saw the ACLU's ad. Really? Let's share the screen. These fundamentalists, they play tough, boy. You go after them. Any chance we can get a friend from Mahawi to see if there's something we can do about that? So much for the illusion of being a person of influence. Okay. Who was George Washington Rapelye? From the book The Great Monkey Trial, published in 1968 by an author, L. Sprague de Camp. I have special affection for this book. I'm sure it was the first one I ever read about the trial. Sprague de Camp tells us that Rapelye was a 31-year-old New Yorker, quote, a dark, sharp-nosed, untidy, intense, argumentative, garrulous little man with poor teeth, end quote. He had grown up in a tough district of Manhattan near Times Square, where he had sold newspapers. Rapelye said he averaged a fight a day to maintain his favored location to sell those papers. Odd jobs took him from New York eventually to Tennessee. He married a Tennessee girl, took a job as a local manager for the Cumberland Coal and Iron Company. By 1925 in Dayton, he'd been there for 3 years, but despite his best efforts, he was still an outsider. The Chattanooga Times described him as a stranger to the South and Southern ways. Unlike most in Dayton, Rapelye was no fundamentalist. His father was a Baptist, his mother was Catholic. In town, he was regarded as a visionary full of wild ideas, and one of his wild ideas was evolution. After he moved to Dayton, he began attending a nearby Methodist church, where a young modernist preacher, Reverend Howard Byrd, persuaded him that evolution and Christianity were not incompatible. More about Reverend Byrd later. De Camp tells the story that Rapelye had an employee who lost a 6-year-old son in an auto accident, and at the funeral the mother was crying, "If I only knew he was with Jesus." And the preacher responded, "I'll not lie to you, but the boy had never been baptized. He had never confessed Christ. There can be no doubt that at this moment he is in the flames of hell." Rapelye was outraged, and he let the minister have it. Rapelye said that a few days later, "I heard that the same bunch, these fundamentalists, had passed that anti-evolution law, and I made up my mind I'd show the world." Share, please. Now, it's Tuesday, May 5th, the day after the ACLU ad looking for the test case. Rapelye is sitting with Frank Earl Robinson, the pharmacist who owned Robinson's drugstore. Of course, Robinson was known as Doc Robinson, or F.E. to his friends. Now, what else was Robinson? He was the chair of the Ray County School Board. What else was Robinson? He was the town's leading textbook seller. In a town like Dayton, the drugstore is the social center. Rapelye and Robinson are sitting in the back with Wallace Haggard, a lawyer whose father owned the leading bank, and they're sitting with Sue Hicks, the town's leading lawyer who had argued for the Butler law. Now, isn't that something? It's 1925, and Dayton's leading lawyer was a woman. Well, it wasn't something, because Sue Hicks was a man. And it's pretty well accepted that Sue Hicks inspired the song "A Boy Named Sue," written by Shel Silverstein. We all know the recording by Johnny Cash. Shel Silverstein, who for some reason attended a judicial conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where Sue Hicks spoke. Gatlinburg is actually mentioned in the song. Next slide, slide number 7. I recently found an interview with Sue Hicks about how the conversation went at Robinson's drugstore. Hicks refers to Mr. White, that's the school superintendent, Walter White. It's not great audio, but I think it's good enough. Let's play it.
I went out with Mr. White and invited him to go over to Robinson's drugstore and have a Coca-Cola with him. And he went, and we were sitting at the table over there, and talking to Mr. Robinson, and talking to each other about this law, this new anti-evolution law that the legislature recently passed. And Mr. Rapelye came in. Mr. Rapelye was a person who was employed by a bankrupt Dayton Iron and Coal Company, and was down there selling iron and coal and stuff from the property that that company still had possession of. And he is out of New York, and he immediately spoke up and said he didn't believe in, he believed in evolution, and this law was a mistake. The legislature hadn't passed it, and we got his argument there, a little with him, talking to him. And Scopes came in. Scopes, who had been teaching school over at the high school and had reviewed Hunter's book a few days before, and in the review he had covered a lot of data relative to evolution. And so he made the statement that you can't teach that Hunter's biology without violating this law, the way I understand it. I said, well, when did you teach it, Scope? And he said, well, I reviewed it just a few days ago, and since the law had been passed. And I made it so the law would apply to him. And I said, let's see one of those books. Mr. Robinson said, I'll sell those books, and I'll go back here and get one of them and show you. And he went back and got it and brought it up there. And the Scope looked in the book and showed us what all they taught in reviewing the lessons for the year in that Hunter's biology. And I made the statement, I said, well, Scopes, looks like you violated this law the way I understand it. I didn't have a copy of the law and didn't know all the details of it, but I read about it. And I said, Mr. Robinson spoke up and said, yes, that we could arrest you and make a test case out of it. And I said, yes, and rapidly put in and said something. And Scopes hesitated a little while, and I said, Scopes, what about it? And he said, well, I'll do it. And that's the way it started. That's the way it started. Thank you.
You can stop the share. Sue Hicks was one of the prosecutors, and I just have to think that his own role played some part in the shaping of his recollection. This interview occurred 30 years after the trial. And I'm inclined to think that his version isn't quite how it happened. Professor Larson in Summer for the Gods says the most credible version of the legend is that Rapelier had hurried down to Robinson's with a newspaper in hand, and he said, Mr. Robinson, you and John Godsey, who's a local attorney, you guys are always looking for something that'll get Dayton a little publicity. I wonder if you've seen the morning paper. So Rapelier had raised the idea. The ACLU is looking for a trial. Somebody's going to do this. Let's do it in Dayton. People will come from all over. They'll rent our hotel rooms. They'll eat our hot dogs, et cetera, et cetera. So Robinson kind of likes this. And the school superintendent, Walter White, likes it. Larson says, White liked the Butler Act, but he loved publicity for Dayton even more. So they needed somebody who had taught evolution in violation of the Butler Act. And one version of the story, they go to W.F. Ferguson, the principal of the high school, who was the regular biology teacher. And Ferguson says, no, don't be ridiculous. I got a wife, I got kids, not interested. Who else can they get? Now, my theory is that Rapelier said, let's get someone who wears the same eyeglasses that I wear. Next slide, please. Next. All right. Who was John T. Scopes? If your image of him is from Inherit the Wind, that's a stick figure. Scopes was way more interesting than that. He left us a wonderful memoir called Center of the Storm that he published in 1966, 4 years before he died. And now we have a full-fledged biography of him by Professor Randy Moore. Scopes was born in Paducah, Kentucky in 1900. In his memoir, he describes Paducah as a place where business, principally the Illinois Central Railroad, brought cosmopolitan people. So Scopes wrote, quote, French and Jews, Germans fleeing Bismarck's wars, all mingled with Native American stock. There was a feeling of mutual tolerance felt by everyone but the town's Negroes, who lived in two main ghettos and fared little better than in other parts of the South and North. Age 13, he and his family moved to Danville, Illinois, a town of about 30,000 people at the time. He says he saw racial integration in school for the first time, up there in the Yankee North. Scopes and his sister were the Southerners. So at school assemblies, he says everyone was seated alphabetically, except the school's two Negroes sat together in the front row, a double desk to themselves, apart from the whites. The school put Scopes and his sister up front also, directly behind the Negroes. Scopes said the school's rationale was obvious. Quote, since Southerners discriminated against Negroes by segregating them, the school officials, being good Northerners, would punish us Southerners by seating us next to the Negroes. End quote. Scopes said, those 4 seats in the stranglehold of the egalitarian North taught me early in life that hypocrisy and prejudice have no Mason-Dixon line, but flourish in all locales and all seasons, and that the evils of self-righteousness in its many guises go endlessly on. Stop share, please. 2 years later, when Scopes was 15, his family moved to Salem, Illinois, the birthplace of William Jennings Bryan. You couldn't write this stuff. Scopes said Bryan spoke there often, quote, giving me an opportunity to study at leisure the man who would later inspire and assist in my prosecution. In his memoir, Scopes tells this story of when Bryan spoke at Scopes' high school graduation, when Bryan made a pronounced whistling effect in enunciating a word. Scopes and his friends couldn't keep from laughing, thoroughly disrupting Bryan's spell on the audience. Scopes says, quote, Bryan stared hard at us, and after he had his speech flowing evenly again, his eyes would dart periodically at us, as if warning us to keep our silence thereafter. The incident was so unusual and possibly traumatic that, to my surprise, Bryan remembered it 6 years later when I next saw him in Dayton. Scopes graduated from the University of Kentucky in the spring of 1924. At the end of the summer of 24, he was offered a coaching and teaching job at the Central High School, the only high school in Ray County, Dayton, Tennessee. $150 a month. The football coach had resigned unexpectedly in late summer. So the school had no coach or anyone to teach algebra, physics, and chemistry. You got that? Football coach, algebra, physics, and chemistry. Scopes accepted, and he said the coaching job was the most important part of the job. Dayton at the time was a town of about 1,800 people. It's about 40 miles from Chattanooga in southeastern Tennessee. Now it's about 7,000 people. It's kind of like Great Barrington. 2 weeks ago, I spent 3 days in Dayton, Tennessee. More about that in Lecture 6. Dayton had been a mining town. By the time Scopes got there, the mines were pretty much closed. There was farming. Scopes said he knew pretty much everybody in town by sight, if not by name. And remember, he was 24 years old, not that much older than his students. He had been in the home of George Rapelier twice. The consensus is that overall Scopes was well liked in Dayton after his time there, even if some disapproved that he smoked cigarettes, danced, and even swore when things didn't go well for the football team he coached. Scopes was friendly with Sue Hicks, with whom he sometimes double dated, and he was friendly with Rapelier. He roomed and he ate with the Bailey family, who owned the biggest hardware store in the region. The Baileys had a son the same age as Scopes. They went to church together on Sunday. Scopes went to church every Sunday that year. His own thoughts were clear. Christian fundamentalism polluted Jesus' words. Scopes said, at first the evolution controversy, then simmering and sputtering, hardly touched my life. Coaching and teaching and attending the Saturday night dances kept me fully occupied in Dayton. Since I didn't teach biology, how could I teach evolution? If I had been the regular biology teacher, I wouldn't have let the law restrict my teaching the truth. How could I have, considering my environmental influences? My father had read to me from Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, Descent of Man, and The Voyage of the Beagle, which I then finished reading for myself. And although not a trained scholar, I thought Darwin was right. That's the John Scopes who got summoned to Robinson's drugstore on May 5th, 1925. Now here's how Scopes describes the sequence of events in his memoir in a chapter entitled Getting Down to Monkey Business. Robinson and others had sent a guy over to the tennis courts where Robinson was playing. And they said, Mr. Robinson would like you to come to the drugstore. So Scopes, in his tennis clothes, walks about 3/4 of a mile to the drugstore. What was he doing playing tennis in Dayton on May 5th? School had ended 4 days before. He had intended to go back to Paducah for the summer before returning to Dayton in the fall. But he stayed a little longer than intended for 2 reasons. First, 2 of his students had been injured in a car accident, and he met a girl. Scopes gets taken back to Robinson's drugstore, and Rapelier and the others are sitting in the back. So Rapelier says to Scopes, we've been arguing, and I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution. Scopes says, that's right. And in his memoir, he writes, not quite sure what Rapelier is leading up to. The biology textbook used in Tennessee was Civic Biology by George William Hunter, Hunter's Civic Biology. It had been used since 1909, and Robinson's drugstore had supplied the textbooks for Ray County. In those days, you had to buy your own textbook. So Scopes grabs a copy of it from the shelf, and he shows it to the men at the table. Rapelier asked if Scopes had been teaching students from this book. Scopes says that he had used it for review purposes while filling in for the principal, who was the regular biology teacher when the principal was out sick. So Scopes opens the book, he shows him the evolutionary chart and the explanation of evolution. He says, you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. Robinson then says to Scopes, oh, so then you've been violating the law. And Scopes says he didn't know technically if he'd violated the law. He knew about the Butler Act. He hadn't worried about it. Because he substituted for the principal. And Scopes assumed that if anybody had broken the law, it was more likely to have been the principal. So what Scopes said at the table was, well, so has every other teacher then violated the law. So Robinson shows him the ad from the Chattanooga News, the ACLU ad. And Robinson says to Scopes, he asks him if he'd be willing to let his name be used for a test case. Scopes says, if you can prove that I've taught evolution and that I can qualify as a defendant, then I'd be willing to stand trial. Robinson says, well, you filled in as biology teacher, didn't you? Yes, when Ferguson was sick. Well, you taught biology then, didn't you cover evolution? Scopes says, we reviewed for final exams as best I remember. Scopes says in his memoir, to tell the truth, I wasn't sure I had taught evolution. Scopes wrote in the memoir, Robinson and the others apparently weren't concerned about this technicality. I had expressed willingness to stand trial. That was enough. Sue Hicks then says to Scopes, as you heard Hicks say, so how about it, Scopes? And Scopes says, go ahead and get your warrant. Now pause right here. In a normal criminal case, the government does not say to the supposed wrongdoer, are you willing to be a defendant in this case? Right? This was not going to be any normal case. So George Rapelier says, I'll swear out a warrant. That will make a big sensation. Why not bring a lot of doctors and lawyers here? Let's get H.G. Wells and a lot of big fellows. Robinson says to Sue Hicks, you and Herbert Hicks, his brother, and Wallace Haggard, another local lawyer who was at Robinson's, you guys can prosecute, and we'll get this lawyer, John Godsey, to defend him. Rapelier takes out a piece of brown wrapping paper, and he writes out a telegram to the ACLU in New York City. Professor J.T. Scopes, he wasn't a professor, Scopes had said don't call him a professor, a teacher of science, of course not biology, he was the football coach, he taught the other stuff incidentally. Scopes will be arrested, charged with teaching evolution, consent of superintendent of education for test case to be defended by you. Wire me collect if you wish to cooperate, and arrest will follow. Rapelier goes to the telegraph office, Scopes goes back to the tennis court. That's Scopes' retelling of what happened. So did Scopes actually teach evolution? Here's a slightly different accounting in the biography of Scopes. The author, Randy Moore, says that Scopes' friend and confidant, a guy named Jerry Tompkins, claimed that Scopes had taught evolution, but not in the biology class, but instead in Scopes' general science class, that some student on March 31st or April 1st, after the Butler Act was in effect, some student asked Scopes about Darwin, and Scopes taught something about it. Whatever. On the next day, May 6th, Rapelier comes back to Robinson's drugstore where the usual suspects had reassembled, and Rapelier reads this telegram from the ACLU. The ACLU says, "We will cooperate Scopes' case with financial help, legal advice, and publicity. Have you competent local attorney? What is plan of prosecution? Has he considered getting federal injunction or otherwise raising federal issue under the 14th Amendment? Please wire collect full particulars and state your connections. When will arrest be made?" I love this telegram. The ACLU wants to know if there's a strategy to get into federal court. And one day earlier, these guys are sitting in Robinson's thinking, we're going to sell a lot of hot dogs if we can get the trial here. So this brain trust agrees that Rapelier should respond with a telegram back to the ACLU. Rapelier says back, "I will secure warrant against Scopes, who will plead guilty to teaching evolution in his class in biology during March and April. Justice of the Peace will find him guilty. He will appeal. Local businessmen will go on his bond pending appeal decision of circuit court on grounds that the law is unconstitutional. We have the consent of Scopes, superintendent of schools, and the chairman of the Board of Education. The attorney of the Board of Education has written the Secretary of State for a copy of the law, which will arrive tomorrow. Justice of Peace trial Saturday." This telegram cracks me up. Rapelier is using terms he surely did not understand. He didn't really mean there was going to be a trial on Saturday. The whole point was to have a huge show trial and bring people to Dayton. The copy of the law, which will arrive tomorrow. They didn't even have a copy of the law yet, right? It wasn't like you went online and could find it, right? Rapelier goes out to send the telegram, and he comes back, and now Sue Hicks is there with the Justice of the Peace, Arthur Benson. Rapelier tells Benson they want a warrant for Scopes' address. So Benson pulls out some blanks out of his pocket, but he admits he didn't know how to fill one out because he had never done that, okay? Hicks says, "I'll do it." He fills it out with a warrant accusing Scopes of teaching evolution in violation of the Butler Act. Rapelier swears to the truth of the warrant and signs it. Now this is getting exciting because Wallace Haggard and the Hicks brothers, these are local lawyers in Dayton, Tennessee. They do wills, disputes about title to property. Now they're going to litigate freedom of speech and religion and all of these big issues. To give you a further idea that from the start this was no ordinary trial, the ACLU offered to pay the expenses of the Hicks brothers and Haggard, but they declined. So for the defense, Doc Robinson suggested this former judge, lawyer John Godsey. We're told Godsey spent most of his time doing title searches. Arrest Scopes. The Justice of the Peace, Mr. Benson, said he personally could not do that. He's the Justice of the Peace, right? You need a sheriff or a deputy. And somebody said they had seen Deputy Swafford nearby. Who do you think offers to go find Deputy Swafford? That's right, Scopes. offers to go find him, to bring in the man who will arrest him. And he does. Swofford gives Scopes the warrant, tells him to appear Saturday, May 9th, before 3 justices of the peace of Ray County. Now, I want to pause here to mention a source that I cite. It's really interesting. In 1959, a University of Tennessee master's candidate, a guy named Warren Allen, submitted a thesis entitled Backgrounds of the Scopes Trial at Dayton, Tennessee. It's noteworthy because he interviewed locals who witnessed aspects of the trial, and also Warren Allen had some game he could write. And he's cited by Larson and others who've written about the trial. So according to Warren Allen, we now have School Superintendent Walter White heading for home, and he meets up with the Reverend A.C. Stribling. Stribling was not just a pastor, he's also the local correspondent for Chattanooga News. White says to Stribling, something has happened here that's going to put Dayton on the map, and he tells Stribling all about it. So one of these guys calls the Chattanooga Times to tell them about this. But Warren Allen says, quote, it seemed to the conspirators that a spirit of enthusiasm was lacking there. So they called the Nashville Banner, quote, where the news was greeted with gusto. The Associated Press and the other news services picked up on the story, and 24 hours later, the whole country knew about it. So Scopes goes home to his room at the home of the Bailey family, and Scopes tells the Baileys about the arrest. And Bailey's son, C.E. Bailey, Scopes' contemporary, he says, well, you don't know what you're in for. Why, William Jennings Bryan will be here prosecuting you in 3 weeks' time. And they all laughed. Saturday, May 9th, Scopes appears before the 3 justices of the peace. They bind Scopes over to the next grand jury for indictment the first Monday in August. They release him on a bond of $1,000. But after the arrest, but before the May 9th appearance, a reporter asked William Jennings Bryan if he would assist with the prosecution in Dayton. And Bryan said he would help if he was wanted. So the reporters in Dayton get to the Hicks brothers, and they ask the Hicks brothers whether they would accept Bryan's offer to help. You bet. So they prepare a wire to Bryan, but somehow the Hicks brothers' wire to Bryan does not get to Bryan, but the press knew of the intended wire, and they told Bryan, and then they reported back to the Hickses. So on May 14th, they write to Bryan that they would consider it the Hickses write to him, Bryan, they would consider it a great honor to have Bryan with them on the prosecution team, right? The press really made that marriage. So Dayton is now sitting pretty, right? They've got a defendant. They've got William Jennings Bryan. What could go wrong? And what could go wrong is one word, Chattanooga. Because those city slickers in Chattanooga must have been smarting that their yokel brothers and sisters down the road in Dayton had scored this PR coup. So the Chattanooga Times sends a telegram to John Neal, one of the lawyers for Scopes, proposing a change of venue to the Memorial Auditorium in Chattanooga. We have a bigger venue for this. And apparently that didn't work, because Warren Allen reports that Chattanooga's second attempt was a competitive arrest. A Chattanooga grand jury heard from some local students, and the name of a Chattanooga teacher was put up for a test case. Warren Allen says Dayton was dismayed. Quote, newspapermen and wire services deserted the town as rats leaving a sinking ship. Dayton took action. First, they called a session of the grand jury. They couldn't wait until the first Monday of August. Scopes, who was now back in Paducah, Kentucky with his family, returned to Dayton, and Allen gives us some great play-by-play. Quote, Scopes herded some of his students into the back of Stumpy Reed's taxicab and coached them in their answers as he had never done in school. Why? We needed witnesses against Scopes. Next, some Daytonians form a protest meeting against Chattanooga. They would tell Chattanooga that Dayton would take its business elsewhere if Chattanooga didn't leave this alone. So to draw a crowd, the organizers decided to have Rapelier make a speech about evolution. But they wanted the reporters back in Dayton. Would a mere speech do it? Maybe not. What could they do to attract the press? George Rapelier knew they were going to stage a fight. So Rapelier enlists a local musician, a performer, Thurlow Reed. Rapelier says he's going to make a speech, and at the end, Thurlow Reed should start a fight with him, Rapelier. And Rapelier, toward the end of his speech, he says, I'm just as certain as I am standing here today that my ancestors swung by their tails out of the grapevines. And speaking of monkeys, there are more monkeys here in Dayton than there are in the Chattanooga Zoo. Whereupon Thurlow Reed yells out, you can't call my ancestors monkeys, and punches Rapelier. Rapelier puts Reed in a headlock, and the two of them thrash about. And apparently these two guys really sold it because others were prepared to join in the fight. A news service reported it as a straight story about the local barber, Thurlow Reed, who had chewed up the man who lectured on evolution. They went to court. Thurlow Reed was fined $35. This was all for appearances. No fine collected. Hold that thought. And Warren Allam says, with all this noise, plus the fact that the teacher bowed out of the Chattanooga test case, that was that, quote, spotlight swung back on Dayton, glory seemed assured. Next slide, please. These leaders of Dayton were promoting this seriously. Doc Robinson and another businessman prepared a 28-page booklet, Why Dayton of all places, because some of the press had said, why is this trial going on in Dayton of all places? A 28-page booklet responding. Larson notes that the booklet makes note of major events that had happened in obscure places. An example, Christ's crucifixion in Calvary. Stop the share, please. These promotional efforts did not escape the attention of the Tennessee Bar Association. At the bar's meeting on June 26th, Attorney Giles Evans, remember Senator Giles Evans who voted against the Butler Act, Evans introduced a resolution protesting against using a criminal trial, quote, as an advertising medium, as is now being done in the Scopes trial at Dayton, Tennessee. And most especially do we deplore and protest against the action of any court in encouraging or fostering or participating in any such advertisement or publicity scheme. This is a dig against the judge who is going to be running for re-election. Who would represent Scopes? Please share. John Randolph Neal, who will join us in a minute. John Randolph Neal was a Tennessee lawyer. He was known as a constitutional expert. He introduced himself to Scopes by saying, whether you want me or not, I'm going to be here. He'd been a law professor at the University of Tennessee. He wound up on the outs there when he went crosswise somehow with the fundamentalists there. In 1924, Neal ran for governor of Tennessee in the Democratic primary and lost to Governor P. So Neal, for a while, was the chief counsel for the defense. Next slide. Who was William Jennings Bryan? Born, as you've heard, in Salem, Illinois in 1860, he was elected to Congress from Nebraska at the age of 30. At the age of 36, he electrified the Democratic National Convention with his Cross of Gold speech, which some refer to as the most famous speech in American political history. It was generally credited with winning him the nomination for president at that convention. Now, on the long list of things on which I am not expert, the Cross of Gold speech and bimetallism are high on that list. But several observations can flow from what are observable, objective facts. First, Bryan lost the election of 1896 to William McKinley. Next, Bryan lost the bimetallism issue in 1900 when the U.S. formally adopted the gold standard. Third, Bryan lost a second bid for the presidency in 1900, and he lost again in 1908. Fourth, after becoming Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State in 1912, He resigned in 1914 over disagreement with Wilson's policies that he believed were leading to our involvement in World War I. Fifth, in 1922, Bryan lost the election for moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church to a Reverend Charles Wishart, a proponent of teaching evolution at Presbyterian-run colleges and universities. Sixth, in June 1924, Bryan attended the Democratic National Convention in New York as a delegate from Florida. We're told that there had been some talk of electing Bryan as a senator from Florida. Bryan says, I'm not running unless drafted, but the incumbent senator liked his job. He wasn't inclined to give it to Bryan. That was that. When Bryan addressed the convention to second the nomination of William McAdoo for president, he was greeted rudely. And Bryan said, this is probably the last convention of my party to which I shall be a delegate. When the audience applauded, Bryan responded, don't applaud, I may change my mind. Are you picking up on a theme here? By 1925, Bryan was largely a speaker and writer. He was apparently finished in politics after his tenure as Secretary of State. Evangelical Protestant lectures were his stock in trade. He averaged 200 speeches a year. He wrote dozens of books. He moved to Florida, invested in the land boom. It made him a wealthy man. Bryan is well known in our history as a progressive. And he's credited with helping to obtain ratification of 4 constitutional amendments. The 16th Amendment, federal income tax, 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, and the 18th Amendment, prohibition. Nobody bats 1,000. His first public address about Darwinism came in 1904. By 1921, he was speaking more widely about the dangers of Darwinism. In 1922, he published his book, In His Image, which incorporated a regular speech of his, The Menace of Darwinism. He called it unscientific and unconvincing. Bryan opposed teaching evolution in part based on his belief that this was an issue of democracy. Quote, the essence of democracy is found in the right of the people to have what they want. If it is contended that an instructor has a right to teach anything he likes, I reply that the parents who pay the salary have a right to decide what shall be taught. A scientific Soviet is attempting to dictate what is taught in our schools. It is the smallest, the most impudent, and the most tyrannical oligarchy that ever attempted to exercise arbitrary power. Well, what did he know? The real issue is not what can be taught in public schools, but who shall control the education system. The disgrace is not the Tennessee law. The disgrace is that teachers should betray the trust imposed on them by the taxpayers by violating that law. What did Bryan propose? Quote, we do not ask that teachers paid by taxpayers shall teach the Christian religion to students, but we do insist that they shall not, under the guise of either science or philosophy, teach evolution as a fact. Now, hold that thought until the last lecture in this course, when we will talk about this so-called balanced treatment approach to teaching evolution and creationism. But Bryan's approach of not teaching evolution, of course, leaves unanswered, what is the biology teacher supposed to teach about the origin of life? Many years later, investigative journalists at The Onion pondered this very question. If it's hard for anybody to read, the headline is, Scopes monkey trial raises troubling question, is science being taught in our schools? One of the articles in the headline asked, should children be exposed to facts? Next slide. Bryan abhorred the Ku Klux Klan, but his vision of the entirety of the populace to be served by his majoritarian impulse was limited indeed. In Scopes' memoir, Scopes told the story relayed to him by Dudley Field Malone, one of the lawyers on the defense team. Malone had worked for Bryan when Bryan was Secretary of State. No, we can go back, sorry. Bryan and Malone traveled together to the Holy Land, which later became Israel. Brian was struck by the primitiveness of the area. Brian says to Malone, "I think we need a paved road up to Mount Sinai. The U.S. could build that road with restrooms for the comfort of pilgrims. Quote, we could have a restroom for the Protestants on the right and one for the Catholics on the left." Scopes added, quote, I've often wondered about Brian's plumbing plans for the Mount Sinai pilgrims. Where did he expect the Jews to go? End quote. To which I add, never mind the Muslims, Hindus, and all the rest. And why are we talking about separate restrooms for Protestants and Catholics? Stop the share, please. Brian said, quote, I was born a member of the greatest of all the races, the Caucasian race, and had mingled in my veins the blood of English, Irish, and Scotch. One has only to consider the limitations upon one's opportunities imposed by race to understand the incalculable benefit of having the way opened between the child and the stars. Brian worried about what happened to the religious beliefs of young people when they headed off to college. Quote, if he, the student, is fortunate enough to have teachers who are themselves Christian with a spiritual vision of life, the effect is to strengthen his faith and he advances to a normal religious life. If he is unfortunate enough to fall under the influence of mind worshippers, he may be led step by step away from faith into unbelief. Brian said elsewhere, quote, there is only one argument that can be made to one who rejects the authority of the Bible, namely that the Bible is true. To put him into fuller context, I offer up the judgments of those of his time. Theodore Roosevelt called Brian an amiable, windy creature who knows almost nothing. The physicist Robert Andrews Millikan called him a pure emotionalist who could not think straight on anything. A paleontologist, William Berryman Scott, said Brian showed invincible ignorance, found it impossible to learn anything, and could see nothing that conflicted with his opinions. Woodrow Wilson said of Brian's ideas about money, Mr. Brian is the most charming and lovable of men, but foolish and dangerous in his theoretical beliefs. But Brian had political skills. He could chase and count votes. He could edit a paper. He could buy and sell things. Plus, his political reformism reached beyond the conservatism of most fundamentalists. Brian favored a Department of Labor, antitrust legislation, federal insurance of bank deposits. So you see references in his back and forth with Darrow about political issues where they made common cause. Brian ran for president 3 times. Darrow publicly supported him and campaigned for him the first 2 times. Darrow tells the story when Brian was running the 3rd time in 1908, Brian asked him to campaign for him again. Darrow asked Brian what he wanted him to talk about. Brian said, the guaranteeing of bank deposits by the government. Darrow replied that his trouble had always been getting money into the bank, not out of it. When Brian was young, he wanted to play the piano, but his father said, girls will play piano, boys the hand saw. Brian said, quote, it is a very pleasant thing for a man to be able to furnish music to company, but it is sometimes done at the expense of other lines of development. If one cannot reach the maximum in both entertainment and service, service is the more important of the two. It is hard to imagine a sharper contrast of personality between William Jennings Bryan and his main adversary at the Scopes trial, Clarence Darrow. Please share. To call Darrow a great trial lawyer does not begin to capture the man. His life and the famous and noteworthy cases he tried could fill an entire OLLI course by themselves. He was born in 1857 in a town called Farmdale, Ohio. To put this in one kind of perspective, a man who was 8 years old when President Lincoln was assassinated is still invoked by many as an iconic figure in parts of contemporary struggles for social justice. What about Darrow and religion? His parents did not hold any of what he called orthodox religious views, but nonetheless, Darrow and siblings went to Sunday school and church on Sunday. Darrow says, quote, "I wonder why children are taken to church. I can never forget the horror and torture of listening to an endless sermon when I was a child. Of course, I never understood a word of it any more than did the preacher who harangued his afflicted audiences." Darrow said his father was the village infidel. Darrow spent a year at Allegheny College. He disparaged his studies in Latin and Greek, and he wasn't crazy about the other courses. What he did love was baseball. But he did some teaching, and that led to an interest in the law. In those days, a legal education was not necessarily 3 years of law school following 4 years of college. Darrow spent 1 year in law school in Michigan, and he worked in a law firm in Youngstown, Ohio. After he got admitted to the Ohio bar, he said he could have opened a practice in Youngstown, but it was a city of 20,000 people, and he felt awed by its size and importance, so he went back home. We can stop the share. Darrow started out as a country lawyer, and in his autobiography, he described the most important case he had in Ohio about suing to recover a $15 harness for a boy who'd received it for tending to a wealthy sick man. He said the case involved 4 trials and 3 appeals over 7 or 8 years. Darrow ultimately won, for which he was paid the grand total of $5. Darrow said, "There was no money involved and not much principal. But then it seemed as if my life depended on the result." Boy, I remember being a first-year lawyer. I know what he's talking about. About this world of country lawyering, Darrow wrote, "The old-time country lawyers fighting over the title to a cow were as clever and sometimes as learned as lawyers now, whose cases involved millions of dollars or human lives." Darrow eventually went to Chicago. He took a position with the city law department, and then he left to become the general attorney of the Chicago and Northwestern Railway Company. This is Darrow, a lawyer for the people, an advocate for the labor movement. That's right. Throughout his career, Darrow represented both those who couldn't pay him $1 and those who could. Some now and then take issue with that, saying he wasn't as pure as his image of him would imply. Well, that aside, his work for the railroad was a little different because it was ideologically loaded. When the American Railroad Union struck in 1894, while he was the railroad's lawyer, Darrow was torn, to the point that he told his employer he couldn't represent the company. He wrote, "I realized my anomalous position. I really wanted the men to win and believed that they should. This had for years been my attitude in cases of strike." He said, "I had no feeling that the members of labor unions were better than their employers. I knew that, like all other men, they were often selfish and unreasonable, but I believed that the distribution of wealth was grossly unjust, and I sympathized with almost all efforts to get higher wages and to improve general conditions for the masses." So Darrow's solution was to continue in a limited role for the railroad, but not regarding the strike, where he represented labor leader Eugene V. Debs. The most recent biography of Darrow is entitled "Attorney for the Damned" by John Farrell. Farrell's book is a wonderful play-by-play of the politically charged cases that had made Darrow the country's leading trial lawyer even before he arrived in Dayton. In the interest of time, I can mention just 3 of them. In 1911, Darrow represented the McNamara brothers, James and Robert McNamara, who were accused in the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building that killed 21 people and injured hundreds more. The McNamaras were activist members of the Iron Workers Union that had been in a labor war with the Times. The case alone could support a whole lecture. The McNamaras pleaded guilty in the face of what seemed incontrovertible evidence, and they were imprisoned. One of the many controversial aspects of the case is that it led to the indictment of Darrow for 2 counts of jury tampering. And those charges were tried separately. The first trial led to an acquittal, the second a hung jury. And most knowledgeable observers say that the evidence was strong that Darrow actually engaged in the bribery of which he was accused. Somehow his reputation survived. In 1920, He represented Benjamin Gitlow, a son of Russian immigrants who was raised on the Lower East Side. Gitlow was charged with criminal anarchy for publishing a left-wing manifesto in a radical newspaper. Listen to Darrow in his closing argument. Is anybody afraid of revolution? For a man to be afraid of revolution in America would be to be ashamed of your mother. Nothing else. Revolution? There is not a drop of honest blood in a single man that does not look back to some revolution for which he would thank his God that those who revolted won. None of you. Take the revolutions out of Great Britain and what is left. Take them out of France and you would have the absolute despotism with the people as slaves. What of our own country? We are 150 years old or thereabouts, and we now speak about revolution as if we were speaking of cutting a man's throat, a nation born in it. If a great playwright wrote that, we'd say that's writing. Well, that was Darrow. The jury heard that, deliberated for 3 hours, and then convicted Gitlow, who was sentenced to 3 to 5 years of hard labor. Lastly, on May 21st, 1924, Nathan Leopold and Dickie Loeb, two wealthy University of Chicago students, kidnapped and murdered 14-year-old Bobby Franks to pursue their fantasy of the perfect crime. Darrow had them plead guilty so as to focus his efforts entirely on what became a 32-day sentencing hearing before a judge. Darrow was hired solely to attempt to spare Leopold and Loeb capital punishment. This is the issue for which Clarence Darrow is best known. Darrow's closing argument to the judge lasted the equivalent of 2 full court days. The biographer John Farrell says that when word spread that Darrow was to begin speaking on a Friday afternoon, 2,000 men and women showed up at the courthouse. Darrow's argument remains recognized as a tour de force against capital punishment. Here's one excerpt. Cold-blooded? Why? Because they planned and schemed and arranged and fixed? Yes. But here are the officers of justice, so-called, with all of the power of the state, with all of the influence of the press, to fan this community into a frenzy of hate, with all of that, who for months have been planning and scheming and contriving and working to take 2 boys' lives. You may stand them up on a scaffold, on a trap door, and choke them to death, but that act would be infinitely more cold-blooded, whether it was justified or not, than any act that these boys have committed or can commit. Cold-blooded. Let the state that is so anxious to take these boys' lives set an example in consideration, kind-heartedness, and tenderness before they call my clients cold-blooded. Agree, disagree, whatever. That's good. Darrow argued that these youths acted based on forces beyond their control. He went on to note the influence on Dickie Loeb of reading Nietzsche's theory of the Superman, that these 2 boys believed that's what they were. Take note of that, because you're going to hear more of Darrow's argument in the Leopold and Loeb case when we get to the case at hand. The judge sentenced Leopold and Loeb each to life for the murder, 99 years for the kidnapping. 10 months after that, Darrow was on again, defending John Scopes. How did Darrow get involved? When he learned of Bryan's involvement, he and his colleague, Dudley Field Malone, sent this telegram to John Neal. We are certain you need no assistance in your defense of Professor Scopes, who's to be prosecuted for teaching evolution, but we have read the report that Mr. William Jennings Bryan has volunteered to aid the prosecution. In view of the fact that scientists are so much interested in the pursuit of knowledge that they cannot make the money that lecturers and Florida real estate agents command, in case you should need us, we are willing, without fees or expenses, to help the defense of Professor Scopes in any way you suggest or direct. And of course, the reference to the Florida real estate agents and lecturers was a not so thinly veiled dig at Bryan, because that's what Bryan was doing at the time. This was the only time Clarence Darrow volunteered for a case. John Scopes tells us in his memoir, the ACLU leaders in New York didn't want Darrow on the case. The ACLU saw this as a free speech case, And Darrow was known to be interested because of his perspective on issues of religion versus science. But the ACLU was going to have to approve Darrow because they were funding the expenses of the case. May 25th, special session of the grand jury. It indicts Scopes. Trial is set for July 10th. This is just 9 weeks after Rapelier called everybody together at Robinson's drugstore. In early June, John Neal and John Scopes go to New York City to meet with the ACLU. The ACLU had decided to try the case with a lawyer named Bainbridge Colby, a New York lawyer who had followed William Jennings Bryan as Secretary of State under Wilson. He was an eminent person. And if the case was going to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is what everybody assumed was going to happen, then they were going to get Charles Evans Hughes, who had been an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. He left to run as the Republican nominee for president. He became Warren Harding's Secretary of State. He returned to private practice by 1925. And later, President Hoover appointed him Chief Justice of the United States. There was one problem with the ACLU's plan. Scopes wanted Darrow. Bainbridge Colby, too dignified. Scopes said that a newspaperman had said about Bainbridge Colby, he can strut sitting down. Somebody else liked that line because it gets used in the movie Inherit the Wind. John Neal and John Scopes met with various ACLU representatives and Harvard law professor, at the time Felix Frankfurter, and attorneys Arthur Garfield Hayes and Dudley Malone. Malone offered his services and Darrow's, and a bitter argument ensued against accepting their services. ACLU said Darrow is too radical, he's a headline hunter, the trial would be a circus. Well, they weren't far off the mark there. Eventually, somebody asked Scopes, what do you want? And he said, I want Darrow. Somebody suggested using Malone, but not Darrow. And Malone said, no deal. That's how the ACLU Executive Committee accepted the offer of Malone and Clarence Darrow. We can stop the share. The ACLU was worried about the case being in Dayton. The lawyers hatched a strategy to get the case into federal court to test the constitutionality of the Butler Act there. But with Bryan having announced his participation, it seemed doubtful that there was any judge who was going to deny the state of Tennessee the opportunity to host such a case. So in June, 68-year-old Clarence Darrow comes to Dayton, as did Bainbridge Colby, who promptly withdrew from the case. Scopes tells a great story about Darrow. Scopes, Darrow, John Neal, and Colby was still with him, were invited to be the weekend guests of the editor of the Knoxville News, Edward Meeman. Meeman tells them that criminal court is in session in the county that they're passing through. Would they like to observe the court sessions? And naturally, Darrow says yes. Scopes says the whole experience was discouraging. He says the poverty, the ignorance, the uncleanliness of the inhabitants of this poor county. Scopes says they're sitting in on a rape case. Scopes says the defendant was pathetic, grinning for no reason, no idea what's going on. Scopes says the defendant was no match for his accuser, a girl in her late teens or early 20s. Scopes said knowledgeable beyond her years. She was pregnant, she said, as a result of the rape. Scopes said, surely appeared that she was using this to escape an embarrassing situation. Scopes says, I was sure she didn't know which lover was responsible for her condition. And they're watching the defendant's lawyer question her, the accusing party, ineptly. So Clarence Darrow is incensed and he says, I'm going to defend that boy. Scopes and the others say, you know, you're an outsider. You might very well prejudice the court and the jury against him. Seeing that Darrow was about to volunteer his services, John Neal and John Scopes each took one of Clarence Darrow's arms, got him to the door, put him in the car, and nobody ever learned the verdict. A few days before the trial was to begin in Dayton, Scopes, Darrow, Neal, and Arthur Garfield Hayes went to Cookeville, Tennessee, to argue in a federal court for an injunction to stop the Dayton trial because the Butler Act was unconstitutional. They filed their briefs shortly before 11 o'clock. They make an argument to U.S. District Court Judge John Gore. By noon, Judge Gore had denied their motion by reading a prepared statement. And no, I have not found anything suggesting a connection to the family of Al Gore. But it's Tennessee Gore. I mean, I don't know if it was a common name. What do I know? On July 7th, a wire service article reported that a clerk in Robinson's drugstore painted in large white letters on the window pane, "Judge Gore refuses to grant injunction." The article said, "The news touched off a heartfelt cheer in Dayton, where townsfolk, with all their preparations made for receiving and entertaining visitors at the trial of John Scopes, had spent an anxious 24 hours." Scopes wrote that Darrow seemed pleased. He had tried to get to federal court, but now he could get what he really wanted, Brian. The trial was set for July 10th. On July 7th, William Jennings Bryan arrived in Dayton. Now, this was now known in Dayton as the monkey business. There were pins seen all around town. Your old man's a monkey. And they also had, that's right, next slide, please. The store, there was actually J.R. Darwin's Everything to Wear store, and this has to be the cleverest of the signs around Dayton. Darwin is right inside. We can stop the share. With Bryan's arrival, the monkey signs came down, the religious posters went up, and Scopes gives a good play-by-play of what happened. The entire town turns out to greet Bryan at the Hotel Aqua. The Dayton Progressive Club throws him a banquet that was the social event of all of Dayton's history. Scopes was invited, along with John Neal, and Darrow apparently was invited also, but he hadn't yet gotten back from Cookeville, where the federal court was. The county school superintendent, Walter White, Scopes' accuser, called Bryan the world's greatest man and first citizen. White was a Republican. Bryan, of course, was a Democrat. Scopes says that after the, quote, inevitable opening prayer, Bryan said to Scopes, "I think you're one of those high school students who made a disturbance at that commencement address I delivered in Salem several years ago." Bryan laughed about it. Bryan said, "There's no reason we shouldn't remain as friends." And Scopes said, "I respected him despite our difference of opinion." Scopes commented on Bryan's appetite. This was such a thing, Bryan's appetite. It's referenced in Inherit the Wind. So Bryan had diabetes. He carried his own saccharin with him. So at this dinner, Bryan declined bread and sugar because he said he's on a diet. He couldn't eat sugar or starches. Scopes ate only part of his own dinner. He didn't touch his own corn or mashed potatoes. Bryan asked Scopes, "Are you going to eat them?" Scopes says no. Scopes says that Bryan, quote, devoured them. The incident was a good tip-off to Bryan's scientific knowledge. His diet prohibited sugar and starches, yet he didn't seem to realize that this included corn and potatoes, or that there were 3 times as much starch in potatoes as in the bread he had refused, end quote. After dinner, Bryan made a speech about the trial being an attack on the Christian religion. Quote, "If evolution wins, Christianity goes." Bryan had a truck with a loudspeaker. He's going around touting Florida real estate while he's fighting the evolutionists. Then Darrow arrived, and the town hastily arranged a similar welcoming dinner. And Scopes says Darrow's off the train for 10 minutes, and he begins making friends with people in town. At the dinner, Darrow accepted the honorary title of Colonel. That's in the movie. And Darrow spoke to the townspeople and got them to like him. Darrow told them he was born in a small town like this. He went to school and he quit school to start his education. Darrow, quote, he says to the people, I started practicing law. For a while, I was playing poker on the side and practicing law, and I almost starved. But then I started playing poker and practicing law on the side, and I made enough money to go to Chicago and open an office. Scope said he became a hit in Dayton. Right? Malone and Arthur Garfield Hayes came from New York. Now, Malone was kind of a dignified, well-dressed kind of guy, but he had a warm enough personality. Arthur Garfield Hayes, then in his early 40s. So we've got Darrow, who's the agnostic, Dudley Field Malone, a Catholic, and Hayes was always described in the materials as having a Jewish background. I don't know whether that suggested somehow that he had disavowed his Judaism. There's no evidence of that. Anyway, it seemed like a strange way to say it. So Arthur Garfield Hayes was described as an idealist who had a lucrative practice in New York while fighting for civil liberties. Hayes played kind of the essential role in crafting trial strategy. I remember as a kid hearing my father talk about all this. He said Arthur Garfield Hayes was doing the lawyering, Darrow was doing other stuff. Share the screen for the next slide. Scopes met the journalist H.L. Mencken. Scopes said Mencken was with the Baltimore Sun, the noted cynic. Scopes said he didn't know Mencken well. He thought Mencken was a sensationalist. Other newspaper reporters had more important roles. Mencken's pieces were more widely read, but Scopes said they had no effect on the defense strategy. But it was Mencken who coined the phrase, the Scopes monkey trial. We can stop the share. The press was an important element of this case. There were 22 Western Union operators in a room off of the grocery store at the start of the trial, just kind of adjacent to the courthouse. From Switzerland, Italy, Germany, Russia, Japan, England, they were all receiving a copy. The Chattanooga Times published a full transcript of the daily proceedings. The radio station WGN of the Chicago Tribune covered the trial. They paid $1,000 a day for the telephone line. That's about $18,000 in today's dollars. Scopes says he kept going to church every Sunday. He said no preacher attempted to save him. He wrote that after he left Dayton, there were many such efforts, quote, proving that the people of Dayton were a great deal more sensible than many in the world outside. Share the screen, please. The case was assigned to Judge John Ralston. Ralston had been a popular local attorney described as being of no special competence. He was a lay preacher in the Methodist Episcopal Church. His term was due to expire in 1926. The next year, he was expecting serious competition. He was a Republican. In 1918, he had beaten a Democrat by only 120 votes, and that was a bad year for Democrats, we were told. So Ralston was expecting a primary challenge for the Republican nomination. Did Judge Ralston want to hear this case? Ed Larson reports that Ralston expedited the case by reconvening the grand jury in a special session to indict Scope, even though state bar officials questioned the legality of such a procedure. Before the grand jury convened, he offered to move up the trial date. Now, Ralston's judicial district spread across more than half a dozen rural counties in southeastern Tennessee. He wasn't scheduled to hold court in Ray County again until autumn. No matter. He said publicly he would try the Scopes case as early as mid-June, and as Larson says, Judge Ralston all but instructed the grand jury to indict Scopes despite the meager evidence against him. The judge told reporters, quote, my suggestion is that a roof be built over a large vacant lot that could seat 20,000 people to use as a courtroom. To give you a little insight into our judge, several months after the trial, he spoke in New York City and he said, If I lose faith in Genesis, I'm afraid I'll lose faith in the rest of the Bible. And if I want to commit larceny, I'll say, I don't believe in the part of the Bible that says, thou shalt not steal. Then I'll go out and steal. The same thing applies to murder. That was Judge Ralston. Slide next, please. The courthouse was the tallest structure in Ray County. It had 400 seats. At the beginning, 400 seats. I have been in that courtroom, which exists today, although no longer is an active courtroom. It's a very big courtroom. It had 400 seats, and at the beginning of the trial, all 400 seats were taken. There were approximately, we're told, 300 more people standing. You can stop. What did those people in the courtroom see? What did they hear? That's for next week when we'll dig into the trial.